Good evening for everyone. Today we have a meeting, we have book talk, A More Perfect Union, and the National Library is hosting today Joshua Livestro from Netherlands, and Marius Vaščega, the head of representation European Commission in Vilnius. So it's really well-known person in Lithuania, and I don't need to introduce a lot Marius. Joshua Livestro is political writer and columnist who had worked as an advisor in London, Brussels, and The Hague, and also, please check if I am wrong, Joshua also had worked as assistant to European Commissioner Fritz Bolkestein.
That is correct.
Okay. So I think Joshua is also a practical person, but also and theoretical, because it's a big book, big monography, the history of European integration, the history of federalization of Europe from 16th century, from 1500 years until now. But in general, I would like to base our debate, our talk. I would like to concentrate on more modern times. But I ask Joshua to tell some introduction at the beginning, and later we will try to speak more on actual on current issues.
Yeah, very good. I will start in 1500 and take it up to 1951 then, and all that in about 15 to 20 minutes. So you'll have to forgive me that I go through it with rather large strides at times. But if you want to, you can read it through at your leisure. It's yours for a mere 198 euros in hardback or 40 euros in paperback. That is the reality of academic publishing these days. They are in a different business from most other publishers, in that they don't seem too interested in actually selling to the public. But the good news is that copies will always be available in the library. And so you have an extra reason to go here in future. Now I take you to the year 1500 or thereabouts, shortly after, and to Florence, the Renaissance city of Niccolo Machiavelli, because it is his work that really serves as a starting point, and specifically his discourses on the first 10 books of Titus Livy. In the second book and the fourth chapter, he reflects on the question of what makes a republic stable, and he decides that in the end it is the ability to expand that is the essential requirement. He looks at the example of Venice first and decides that it's the lack of this ability that in the end made Venice vulnerable to more powerful neighbors, and so he tries to explain to his compatriots that we need to reflect on what methods for expansion there are, and he comes up with 3. The first he dismisses as largely useless. It's the method of violent conquest, and this is what we nowadays would probably call the Putin method. He links it to classical history, to the Athenians and the Spartans, and he warns that, you know, though they had brief moments of success with it, it is very difficult to execute, and once you've executed it, usually impossible to hold for the longer term. So let's not go down this route. That hasn't stopped people in following centuries from trying. And sometimes history is wonderfully predictable in that those who practice this method the most, gentlemen whose armies you have been acquainted with, like Hitler and Stalin, were also quite outspoken opponents of the federal method. Both actually wrote anti-federal tracts. But we're going to leave this first method aside and we look at the other two, and they were called, in Machiavelli's parlance, the method of Rome, where one powerful republic places itself at the head of an alliance and expands further and further, basically by making these other territories do its will. And the other one is where a group of republics or cities band together on the basis of equality. And they look after their mutual defense and economic interests, but they also have an objective of expanding this common territory. And he calls this the League. Eventually, in the early 18th century, in the debate about the Acts of Union in Scotland, which turned England and Scotland into a united kingdom, the term federal union was introduced for this concept, but it was directly based on Machiavelli's work. And so these two methods, the sort of more constructive methods for expansion, were both eagerly discussed and embraced. And you can imagine why that is, because the two are representative of a typical late medieval and early modern problem, where through a marriage or through an inheritance or sometimes through other things, like one method was where one territory would give part of its territory as it were in loan in return for a sum of money, and if it didn't repay the sum, then the land was forfeit and it belonged to the new one. Now, the question of whose regime would apply in this new territory was essentially a question of union, right? Is it the one of the old territory or the new one to which it is attached? And on what basis is it then attached? Does it become an integral part of it, or does it become a quasi-federation? And this problem is also well known in Polish-Lithuanian history. It goes back to the Union of Kriewo, which creates this union as a marriage union, and therefore essentially as a personal union, represented in the figure of your Grand Duke becoming King Jogaila, right? In the Union of Kriewo, it talks about the Grand Duchy being permanently attached to the Polish kingdom, and the Latin term that is used is applicare. Now, there was a virtually 2 centuries long debate about what this word meant. The Poles said that it meant, well, the two become one. It's what we know as a term for incorporation, so where the Poles essentially took the Lithuanian territory within itself and it became a single larger entity. Whereas the Lithuanians argued, and for nearly 200 years quite successfully, that in fact the two unions, remained independent within this single union. So it's essentially a question of sovereignty. And this question of sovereignty is one that comes back again and again in the history of federal unions. Anyway, in the end, in 1569, obviously, in the Union of Lublin, this question is resolved, seemingly at first sight in favor of the Poles, but really, if we look at the structure that is adopted, with separate armies and separate fiscal facilities, with even separate parliaments underneath this joint unified parliament, it was really a sort of federal structure, and that is also how it's been interpreted in the history of federalism. And that raises the question, then, obviously, of what sort of constitution did it have? And oddly enough, both in the case of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the other main federal examples of the time, actual constitutional thought was not that well developed, because federalism, to the extent that they had a word for it, was more a way of doing something, of being together, as it were, than of actually constructing things legally. And representative of that, in a sense, was this concept of the golden liberty that this union was supposed to protect. Right, the golden liberty of every individual member of the same, everyone involved in decision making, and to the political manifestation, or the legal manifestation of that was the veto power. They were not generally inclined to use it, but the fact that they had it was a representative of the freedom that they had, and so civic culture was the foundation for this particular union, rather than the legal construct. Now, eventually, a fifth example of a union on this basis, on a cultural basis, was introduced across the Atlantic. But it was very much a European-style federal union, the first American union of the Articles of Confederation. And it was its failure and the growing failure that became apparent of the other four unions. This was obviously after the first partition of the early 1770s, that persuaded the American founders that a more perfect union was required. And they had the rather brilliant idea of looking for a constitutional solution in law rather than in culture. And so they created a first fully sort of legal construct for a union, with a very intricate system of checks and balances, where power was divided not just horizontally between the legislature, the executive and the judiciary, but also vertically between the center and the member states. And to make that system work, they also introduced a new concept of a division of sovereignty. So, whereas previously all sovereignty lay with members of a federation, now we had a construct where the center had a claim to sovereignty as well as the states. Remarkably enough, while the Americans succeeded in perfecting theirs, the four continental unions all disappeared around the same time. By 1787, when the Constitution is created in the US, the four still cover between a third and half of the territory of continental Europe. By 1806, they have all disappeared. And they have disappeared in the maelstrom of the Napoleonic Wars, but really also collapsed under their own failings. And to the extent that the idea survives, it survives at a different level, and it becomes the inspiration for a new kind of federation at a European scale. This idea had roots that go back about 200 years. The first ideas were articulated by a French monarch and Henry IV and his advisor, the Duc de Sully. They are supposed to have written a master plan called that's become known as the Grand Design. And the Grand Design tradition is one that is carried forward into the future, where thinkers, great and small, and politicians draw up plans for the unification of Europe. And they have to answer two questions there. One is it possible, and if so, how? Right? And the debate there is about, do we use violence to establish it, or do we use negotiations? Is it essentially a union of to end all wars, or is it a union of perpetual peace? And the other question then is it desirable? In the 18th century, there is essentially a philosophical debate. The old monarch participates in it. like the Prussian king. But mostly it's left to the philosophers to debate this. There are two camps there. One is the camp of Voltaire and others like him, who say that, well, yeah, we have a European republic of sorts, but we sort our conflicts out essentially on the battlefield. And that method works quite well. And then afterwards we settle these conflicts through negotiations. That creates a sort of, yeah, almost jurisprudence, if you like, through these treaties. And that system seems to work broadly to avoid a major kladderadatsch. So we don't want to tinker with this, and we don't want to over-ask, and that is what he accused the other side of, which was represented by a writer called Abbé de Saint-Pierre, early 18th century philosopher, who argued that really, if we want to establish perpetual peace, we have to find a negotiated solution that allows this to function permanently. He really stressed the benefits of this to all involved. Wrote a separate book as an attachment to his plea for perpetual peace, where he explained to every individual country involved what its benefits would be. And so for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, for example, he explained that you can count on the insistence of other countries if you're ever invaded by anyone, read Russia. The monarch can become a hereditary monarch, which to the monarch is obviously an attractive concept, because in the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the election system always was a major point of contention, and monarchs were rarely secure in their position. And for the Szlachta, the lower nobility, he said that the perpetual peace would actually be the thing that could really enshrine their golden liberty forever. In the end, there were no takers for his idea, at least in the 18th century, in spite of the principled defense of it by people like Voltaire and ultimately also Immanuel Kant. But in the course of the 19th century, the idea gets picked up by what is called the peace movement, which is a sort of ragtag collection of activists of various kinds. You have Christian activists, you have economic free traders, anti-tariff, strongly anti-tariff, and you have, oddly enough, a number of nationalist movements, including the Polish one, obviously. After the third partition, Poland as an independent Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as an independent reality disappears, but the idea survives and strongly in the hearts of people in the region, and it finds a new vehicle in this European federal idea, where they dream of a Europe not of states but of nations. So they imagine that the map would be completely reordered, and the federal structure would then create the space for a rebirth of the Polish nation. In the work of Adam Mickiewicz, for example, in the Books of the Polish Nation, the famous poem, where he actually projects the idea of the Commonwealth on the whole map of Europe. So Europe as a reimagined Polish-Lithuanian project, as it were. This conflict, this idea was in conflict with the Holy Alliance of monarchs, where the idea of perpetual peace had also been introduced, but differently. The monarchs involved thought of it as a way of guaranteeing long-term stability. But these two conceptions of federalism fight it out over the course of the 19th century until we get to around the turn of the century, where the idea all of a sudden becomes prominent on the international stage through the two big peace conferences in The Hague, where the proponents of this idea argue that this is essentially a proto-union that we create, because we're all sitting together, we're trying to solve problems in advance, And we're passing law, which is a completely new thing, obviously, on the international stage. And it is fully at the heart of the new construct that is created after the First World War, the League of Nations. That league was complicated in theory by the fact that it was supposed to be a transatlantic one or even a global one. The idea of it, American involvement goes back to the early peace movement, which was in part inspired by American religious activists, Christian activists, and to find a solution for their presence in the early conferences, they had Victor Hugo, the writer, came up with this idea of two sister unions either side of the Atlantic, reaching across the Atlantic and creating a new union, as it were, in that handshake. And that becomes the idea behind the League of Nations. But the League of Nations is, from the start, plagued by the same shortcomings that older European leagues had as well, in that it doesn't resolve the sovereignty issue, runs into the veto everywhere, and also doesn't seem to have, because of the lack of American involvement in the end, didn't have that common bond of brotherhood that was envisaged. So there isn't really a cultural foundation, and there isn't a strong legal foundation either. So its failings is, as it were, baked into the cake, and we see the manifestations of that in the 1930s, where you get Brexit, Germany leaving the league, and where you see individual member countries completely violating the principles of it in Manchuria, and the league is powerless to do anything about this, and so we see a return to what was the other great organizing principle that was proposed by people like Voltaire in the 18th century as the way of organizing things in the balance of power. And in record time, in the late 30s, we slide into war because, well, that is in the end its organizing principle. War is how we resolve things, and war was how things were resolved, only on a much greater scale than any of the participants could have anticipated at the time. This failure of the latest incarnation of a European or quasi-European federation is then what inspires the sort of explosion of new blueprints that are produced during the war and immediately after it. To solve this issue of the failing of the League of Nations is very much what is the core purpose of all these efforts. There are then broadly two strands in this debate. The one is the British one, which returns in a way all the way to the classical idea of a league can succeed if it's based on a joint sense of civic belonging, a joint willingness to make it work. The Brits argued that the reason that the League of Nations failed was not because of the veto, but because there were too many bad faith actors in it. And so if we want to reconstruct it, we have to work on this common will and not tinker with the veto, because that would just create too many problems. Against that, the French, most importantly, obviously, Monnet, argued that really, based on his own experience at the League as well, where he worked, of course, for a while, we have to learn from the American example, by which he was quite inspired, that in the end only a division of sovereignty where the center was given its own claim to sovereignty could create a union that would last. And we get this period immediately after the war where there is a sort of a great sense of experimenting with federalism at every level. So obviously at UN level, transatlantic in the form of NATO, which to the American negotiators who were most closely involved in it, was very much intended as a sort of proto-union. They built in a number of little back doors that they thought could eventually be used to establish a more confederal, at least a confederal type structure. I think those doors at the moment are firmly shut, but we can talk about that a bit later. But the third one is very much at the European level. There you have both Brits and the French in the end constructing their own type of union. They're both still with us today. Obviously, the Council of Europe is still a going concern, and importantly so, obviously, through the European Court of Human Rights. But arguably, the more successful is the one that managed to create a union based on a sense of shared sovereignty, and that was the European Coal and Steel Community, which is, as we know, is the proto-EU, as it were. So that is the thread that I followed all the way back and then traced all the way up to 1500. And I think arguably in the days that we live in, Machiavelli probably makes quite a useful founding father, at least to steel our resolve a little bit in these uncertain times.
Thank you, Joshua, for amazing introduction. I remind here also to British historians, because I am feeling your adoration, satisfaction about the history of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So I'm not sure that you know, it's Robert Frost and Richard Butterwick. They wrote. Frost wrote very popular. Robert Frost visited Vilnius and Kaunas a lot of times. Frost wrote a very popular history of Polish-Lithuanian Union, and he's professor in Edinburgh. And Butterwick, he's specialist of 18th century, and then especially also of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and he wrote, Butterwick also monography about constitution and of 1791, and also as the final act of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Yeah. So both of them they are coming very often to Vilnius University, to Vytautas Magnus University. So both. But both are very, very known here. In general, this topic is not so popular. So the history of federalization of Europe, especially with connection of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, is not so well known. So I think especially in West Europe. I think
no, exactly. I mean, Butterwick. I know and admire his work greatly, Light and Flame, about the 18th century Commonwealth. No, I think generally to the extent that we in the West know about the history of the Commonwealth, it's used a bit as a byword for gridlock and outright failure especially to defend themselves against these three partitions. But I think by doing that, it doesn't do justice to the full history of the Commonwealth. Probably, in my view, arguably the greatest modern historian of the Dutch, the long Dutch Republican tradition, is a man called Jonathan Israel. He wrote a book called The Rise, Greatness and Fall of the Dutch Republic, and I think you could easily write a book under a similar title about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, because obviously for a very long time it was a colossus on the European stage and a very meaningful actor, and the mere fact that it managed to create this union, then maintain this union, then give political form to this union, when it had no real examples in front of it of how to do that, is already a tremendous achievement, and makes it, in my story at least, one of the more significant actors. But beyond that, there are, I mean, clearly also lessons to learn from it. In the positive sense, how did it manage to create this underlying cultural sense of unity, of joint willingness for quite a long time, for hundreds of years, to maintain this union, even without clear legal or institutional structures to maintain it. But there are also negative lessons, and especially about the veto, and I think that is quite topical for today.
And I allowed also for myself also to add the third historians. It will be, I think, correct if I will name here also Timothy Snyder. His first book, it was Reconstruction of Nations, so it was the history of Poland, Lithuania and Ukraine, because now it's Snyder is very popular in CNN and BBC. He is commenting the situation in Ukraine and also criticized Trump a lot, of course. So, but Snyder, the first book of Snyder, also translated to a lot of languages. It's history of Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine from 1569 till now. So this is his. It was the first door.
That's my kind of project.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, but now maybe I hope we can try to jump to 1950 to Schuman Declaration. If I can invite you for such adventure to jump to 1950 to 9th of May, Schuman Declaration. And Schuman idea, we will celebrate this year's 75th anniversary of Schuman Declaration. And maybe I would like to ask Marius, what do you think? You are a practical person, had worked also for a long time in Brussels, now in Vilnius. If we can fantasize, if we can allow for ourselves to philosophize little, did Schuman imagine in 1950 that his project, his idea, it will be such successful, I can say, when we speak about quality of integration inside European Union, and also about this geographical size from Roma till Tallinn, from Lisbon till Bucharest. Marius, what do you think? Of course, you are not historians, how I know. So you are from today perspective. What you think? How Schuman will check our today's situation?
I think he should be happy seeing how far his ideas can go. And you mentioned, the size, the geographical expansion which this idea took from a few founding countries and now to 27. Right, a few years ago, 28. But I think what is the most important here, when you think about the geographical dimension of this whole enlargement, is how many new countries want to join. It's that shows really the success. I mean, here internally we can always think and look at the problems and think what needs to be fixed and what does not function. But there, from outside, there are countries which are looking at this. Actually, that it functions much better when you're inside than when you are outside. And this is something for us to always keep in mind. We also have another, line of countries around which are not formally within the European Union, but they are in fact very much aligned. And here we have to mention also Norway, we have to mention Iceland, we have to mention Liechtenstein. We also have to mention Switzerland because it's also within there, and I mean via different types of legal mechanisms, but they are also very much aligned. And while they are not participating in the decision making, all these countries that I mentioned, but you know, they are super close to us. So I think this shows that as a model, as an idea that works, we always have to look at all these countries, and I think Schuman should have been very happy. He should have also been very happy if you look from where he started. You know, he just talked about two super important industrial bases at that moment, coal and steel. But I mean, we are way past that. And we've been going into the areas we were never, I don't think he was ever imagining these things, you know. Of course, that shows the limits, how far we can go, where the method needs to change. And that brings then the question, you know, and that's why the book, I was really curious, the More Perfect Union, and about the federalism, how far can we be going? Because at the end, I think people want to keep their nation states, and that is also important to keep in mind. We can speak about that also a little bit later, but you know, Lithuanians, as much as they love the European Union, once you say a word federalism, it is a trigger. It is a trigger. Maybe because people do not know always what exactly is in that definition, but it triggers often. So, so on one hand, you have you understand that you know, all the steps that we were taking were going towards closer union. So a little bit more federalism, very well balanced, but a little bit more. And then when you say the word itself, people are becoming immediately, they go down. So this is also something interesting for us to think, why is this happening, and are we not doing enough of certain explanation, or I don't know. I'm just putting it as a question.
Yep. Well, I'll pick it up and run with it then. First about whether Schuman could have imagined it. Yes, and in fact he did imagine it. In speech, obviously, he talks about all Europeans without distinction, whether from east or west, right? And so it's also built in into the treaty that is finally negotiated. Like virtually every federal union ever established, it has an expansion clause, and so the idea of expansion, logically, because it's based on this Machiavellian notion of expansion, is an essential part of the construct that he envisaged. Whether it would he would have dared to dream of how successful it's become is another matter. But he also explicitly talks about the thing that he wants to build as a federal union. He made no bones about that. Neither did Jean Monnet, who even talked about the United States of Europe. And in fact, after he left the first version of the Commission, the High Authority at the European Coal and Steel Community forms an action group specifically to establish the United States of Europe. But the fact that they talk about it as an end goal also builds in the fact that people can reasonably expect that what they're joining is not quite that yet. And that is sort of the logical flaw at the heart of the project that they undertake, because really what I show in the book, I think quite clearly, is that we are already a federal union and have been since the inception. But we don't really seem to understand what that means. A real federal union is based on a division of sovereignty, and so not a complete sovereignty at the center, nor a complete sovereignty for the member states. The first is an empire. The second is just a loose collection of countries that will be scattered to the four winds the moment they run into a serious confrontation of any kind. But it is in this division of sovereignty that the strength of a union lies, but also its challenge, obviously, because it is not a division that is cast in stone. The American founders, Madison specifically, describes it as a sort of an intricate system of checks and balances that constantly lean over to one side or the next and therefore require internal corrections. In political practice, that means that member states will always want more of their sovereignty back. Some who work at the center will demand ever more powers for the center. And the citizen who's caught in the middle will look at it and wonder, like, well, yeah, what am I supposed to make of all this? It's easy then to create a boogeyman version of federalism, especially when you turn an idea like ever closer union into an idea that we must give ever more powers to the center, which is then gratefully also embraced by some in the center who say, yeah, that's exactly what we have to do. But we don't have to. We can still have a decision-making where the member states take most of the meaningful decisions, only not with veto power. So we take them jointly and on a consensus basis, but no longer with the power for individual countries to block everything. Because I think we can agree, based on the current experiences with Hungary, that that's not necessarily a great idea.
The next my question is about some differences, some splittings between Old Europe, West Europe, and East Central Europe. Is this splitting still exist? Is one thing, one question, and can we say that also Euro enthusiasm is different in East Central Europe and in West Europe, or now after when 20 years passed after our membership in European Union, and in general, how it looks from the perspective, for example, Netherlands. They are East Central Europe and West Europe, or it's now these differences are cancelling slowly, and nobody is telling about 2 Europes. Yeah, maybe Joshua.
It's a geographical reality, obviously, and to an extent also a political one. But the fascinating thing about the Union as we have it at the moment, and undoubtedly it will change again when 27 become 34, maybe 35, right? Is that at member state level you start to see all sorts of coalitions emerge. And that's been going on for quite a while. I think Brexit really sped up this process, as it were, certainly for us in the Netherlands. We have looked for various kind of coalitions and coalition partners, and under the figure of Mark Rutte, that at times seemed to depend on what particular issue we were dealing with. So on one economic issue we could work with Spain, on another with the Nordics and the Baltics, or with perhaps also including the Irish, and with others again with France. Oddly enough, less with Germany, apart from when it came to saying no on certain issues. The Germans are very good at saying no, although at a crucial point they forgot the meaning of the word. But at the moment, I would say what's interesting about that coalition process is that I have to give credit for the analysis to the ambassador who pointed this out in conversation yesterday, that the Baltics and the northern states, in a sort of great arc all the way through Scandinavia to Denmark and Iceland, seem to be uniting on a common set of purposes. And it leaves us out in the cold a little bit, in that sense that you are not natural coalition partners. So we don't look at you as very far abroad, but because of our own internal political problems, we haven't been able to join that coalition, of which we were very much a part under Mark Rutte. And I'm all in favor of doing it again. Whether the population sees it in entirely the same terms, I don't know, but I think they are broadly sympathetic to the concerns and the priorities that you have at the moment. I think if I look at the polling in Holland, that seems to confirm that.
Well, I think what is interesting to look at is to look a little bit which countries currently say, or the people in which countries currently say that they are really trust in the EU. That's one of the questions which is being regularly asked, and actually the answer, which when you look at the at those countries who trust most, is a bit strange. It's because there you can see countries from different parts of Europe and not necessarily correlated to any kind of geographical regions that we have in our mind. For example, the country that most trusts the EU at the moment in the latest Eurobarometers is Denmark. Number two is Lithuania, and you could say, okay, this is a bit of this arc of eastern northern countries which are facing and really feeling some existential threats related to hard security and really defense. But then number three is all of a sudden Portugal. And then you go to the Netherlands, which is also showing a lot of trust as well. Although if you look back at and there were various votes and so on referenda, you could think that there is a certain skepticism, but here, at least at this particular stage, it shows a lot of trust. Then there is Sweden, Poland, Latvia, Finland. So there is a bit of this eastern northern flank, but you also have others in there. So I think at the end of the day, it's probably the explanation for this could be twofold. On one hand, it could be that the people feel that the EU is solving certain problems which they think are the most acute at the moment. That's one thing, or at least is capable of solving them somehow like this. And then secondly, presumably the predominant political discourse, and here, of course, I cannot speak for the Netherlands or a few other countries, but feeling a bit how it is in Lithuania, the predominant political discourse is positive towards the EU itself, because a lot on EU belongs to all the countries and all the people of the EU, also to all the governments in the same sense. So a lot of depends on how government communicates, of how government sees, or how government speaks about a certain, about the EU. That also helps to influence the point of view. So this is a bit to give to show you how the Eurobarometer looks at it. So some answers, but also some questions here.
Ambassador, you would like to add?
Thank you, Sean. I will join you in sitting down. That's a good habit. Thanks so much. Very interesting discussion, very poignant questions, I would say. With regard to the Eurobarometer and from the Netherlands perspective, and as a small kind of background and the explanation, there are basically two things, to see what the negative impact was for the UK from the fallout of Brexit. That has really changed part of the discourse, wider than call it the bubble that normally talks about politics in European Union. People have seen indeed the difficulties. A lot of Dutch businesses, for instance, exporting flowers, tomatoes, whatever to the UK, the kind of paperwork they run into. And then seeing the economic figures in the UK, which are not encouraging since Brexit, to put it mildly, has really had an impact, a positive impact in the sense of the view of Europe / the European Union in the Netherlands. The other impact has been obviously the pandemic. The pandemic showed for the first time to a lot of people, ordinary citizens, businesses, but also government officials, the realities of the real interconnectedness and the risks. And if you want to tackle that you need to go to a higher level, so to say higher in terms of political or more clout to be able to solve that. And that brings me actually to my additional question, and that's the thing that I always, the European story, the European narrative, we tend to go in the success story of the European Union, and whether you call it a federal union already or not, but the success story of the European Union is so often forgotten in the times when there is no crisis and there are not barbarians at the gate, so to say. So what are we going to do within Europe that we have indeed that one European story, that narrative, that common understanding what the history of Europe is, where we came from and where we aim for? That is what is missing. And just one little suggestion, I do really think that people in the western part of Europe, where I'm from originally, should understand what happened on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain since 1945. They should understand, for instance, that Lithuania was only liberated in the end of the Second World War for here was 1990, 1991, not 1945. And that kind of common understanding, that's lacking for the peace times. And we actually do quite well in the war times. That's a funny thing.
Yeah, I'm happy to follow up on that. Specifically, a discussion that we had yesterday in a different forum in the Parliament here, where we also talked about this lack of a narrative, as it were, and then the discussion focused specifically on enlargement. Yes, there is a new wave coming. We talked about the geopolitical necessities of those things, right? I think we can all agree on the necessity of bringing Ukraine and Moldova into the Union. That at the same time we also finally want to resolve the issues that have stopped us from including the various states in the Balkans, and that challenge brings with it the question of, well, how are we going to deal with that politically at home, as it were? I, and fortunately at least one other participant, argued that we should really look at the experience of previous waves of enlargement, and not just to learn from what was said at the time, but also to evaluate them as the great success story that they really are. Because that is the particular genius of the European version of the enlargement story. Machiavelli argues you can expand, but you can expand to a certain point because then the decision maybe becomes too difficult. The American version of the expansion story is one of continuous internal conflict until they lose the ability to settle those conflicts in some form of compromise in the 1850s. And then they rush headlong to civil war. And it's all about expansion because they can't agree on which version of the law should apply. The one of the north, that is slavery-free, or the one in the south that has slavery. And in the end, they try to solve it mathematically and partly diplomatically. When those two things are no longer available to them, only the battlefield remains. And the European enlargement story is remarkable in that it has been largely peaceful and friction-free. That said, obviously, because we didn't have this sort of narrative around it, the story of enlargement in the West became the one of the Polish plumber, and the sort of economic downside for the average man. Well, the Polish plumber has disappeared. I think they largely disappeared during the COVID outbreak. But they haven't returned, and I think we're almost at a tipping point where we will see the first Western plumbers head east because living standards here have caught up, and the people go to where the work is available, and that may well be out here. That story is one that we have been not very good at telling. The story of that tremendous integration success, the economic uplifting, and the fact that in enlargement we still maintained a great sense of unity. And so I would think going forward that is one of the big challenges, to pick that up and to develop a credible narrative around that.
Well, just to add very quickly, indeed, I think one thing where we should be really more active is the enlargement story, indeed. On one hand, showing, how things have changed here, but maybe also the other way around, showing, how many good things also enlargement has been bringing up in terms of new business opportunities and possibilities for businesses to expand. These are the things which we remember from time to time, but that should somehow be more consistent, and I think should be kind of a basic knowledge in the minds or understanding. That's one thing. But secondly, I think more generally speaking about the story of the European Union, it is also something which we have never been asking ourselves, where exactly are we with the European Union? These kind of meta questions we started, in fact, asking when we saw the shocking results of the British referendum to leave the European Union. And this was the time, which I saw also internally within the European institutions, which pushed us to look for answers. Why? How is it possible? For what are the reasons? Where we are with this union, what are various scenarios of further development? It triggered certain thinking. Somehow, I'm coming back to the idea which was mentioned here several times. Crisis triggers a bit of a wider thinking, and then you all of a sudden realize where exactly you are, and then you start thinking, okay, how do I go forward? I think now we are understanding it much better. At least I would hope so after some years. Not really 100% and so on. The good things in life or the good institutions are a little bit like air we breathe. You do not feel them until you see that something is wrong. When you have lack of air, then you immediately realize that something is, what a good thing is to have this air. So it's a little bit the same with institutions, and maybe that's why we only feel it during the times of crisis.
Okay, thank you, Marius. Absolutely, the last round of questions. I would like to remind at the end of our debate two white papers. One paper, now it's maybe a little forgotten. It was published 9 years ago by European Commission with President of Jean-Claude Juncker, and it was a white book for future of Europe, where Juncker presented 5 scenarios and of the future of Europe, and also it was used the term two-speed, Europe of two-speed, and this term was very criticized, especially in East Central Europe, and now we have another white paper for European defense. And we're discussing now in Lithuania a lot, especially in context that Audrius Kubilius is European Commissioner for Defense, Industry and Space. So thanks Kubilius and his activity. But in general, of course, Baltics spoke and are speaking and discussing a lot about European defense. So these 2 white books. So because now these books about for future of Europe, it's became really forgotten, and who knows? Maybe we will have stabilization with Ukraine quite quick. So I'm fantasizing, of course, and maybe this European white paper for defense also it will be forgotten. What you think about? So it's the last provocation, the last question. So Marius, if I can ask you at the beginning.
Well, I think the first white paper which you mentioned, the one coming from the President Juncker, it was exactly the response to the Brexit referendum. you know, Brexit referendum indeed triggered the thinking where we are, how far are we in our union, where we want to go, you know. Maybe we want to scale back. You were also speaking about the fact that member states always want to scale back, and this was one of the reasons why, you know, the campaign for the Brexit referendum was taking place in the UK. So at that moment, President Juncker put forward several different scenarios. A bit less Europe, all steam ahead, you know, or we go ahead in certain areas and so on. He also spoke about different speeds. We are, in fact, in different speeds. We are in different speeds. If we think about it, Lithuania has only, you know, has also undergone various speeds of Europe, because when Lithuania joined the EU, it was not member of Schengen, it was not member of Eurozone. At the moment, we have, you know, many still member states which are not members of Euro. Some want to join, others less, but, you know, we are speaking about, as a big achievement, that Bulgaria and Romania joined the Schengen zone. So all these things, they speak about different realities. There are less known examples, like the European Public Prosecutor's Office. By the way, a very successful institution, an invention of the EU, that sometimes when you have a cross-border crime, maybe it's easier to have one institution that looks at the crime, and that was a difficult frontier to overcome. This is certainly a step of doing things together, because criminal law is like taxes, like defense, and you asked about defense, I will come to that in a minute. It's at the heart of every state's sovereignty, so it's really difficult to give it away. Not all the member states are participating in the European Public Prosecutor's Office. You know, is it bad? Probably it raises a bit the costs of us operating, because you need to know all the intricacies. Somebody is operating, somebody is less, who is financing, how you then look at the funds, you know, to those institutions and so on, because often those who do not participate, they also do not want to contribute to the funds, and all these things, they make, you know, they make the whole situation kind of more complicated, more costly to run. On the other hand, they also enable us to run those solutions which otherwise could not run. So I think it's good. Just we need to see that it does not make us so complicated that that we are not able to function anymore. So this is about the multi-speed Europe. I don't think we need to be afraid of the term. It's a bit the term like federalism, you know. Nobody knows what's exactly in it, and that's why it immediately raises concern. But if applied well, if applied according to the rules which we ourselves have set up, all these, it's called enhanced cooperation. We find the terms, you know, for these things. Enhanced cooperation, meaning that a certain number of countries, there is a minimum number of countries which can cooperate on a certain solution, like the European Public Prosecutor's Office, and then it's an EU solution, despite the fact that a few are not within it. So let's not be afraid of these things if they allow us to move forward. Defense. This is certainly a new frontier and a new homework that we need to do. You mentioned Schuman, but we also should remember other founding fathers of the EU, and one of them is Monnet. And Monnet has always been saying that Europe will be forged in crisis and will be the sum of the solutions that will be adopted during those crises, something like that. From that perspective, every step in our cooperation was triggered by certain crises, be it external, be it internal, but certain crises. So the threat which we're seeing, you know, the military threat which we're seeing from the east, from Russia, it is definitely pushing us to the new frontier, to the new solutions, and that is ramping up our defense capabilities together. Because if we want to stand together as a union, 27, able to expand, able to thrive, which we have been always guaranteeing, the essence to be safe. So I think this is just the beginning of the new mandate of the European Commission. The white paper on defense has been put forward, one of the first initiatives of the new Commission. So you have really a lot of political mandate still to develop it, to develop the ideas, to put further solutions on the table, and I'm sure that will be done, and we will be seeing good implementation of the ideas that have been put there.
So when we look at the idea of multi-speed Europe, then the suggestion is, of course, well, I'll walk at 5 kilometers an hour, you'll run at 10, you'll get there first, but I'll get there eventually as well, right? That is the original idea behind it. A French, the sort of propagated version is slightly different, is that you have a core that does everything, and then you have further rings that do sort of gradually less and then even less. And so, you have a basic membership and a sort of membership plus, and then you have the gold card version, as it were. And the question is then, with that, is the logic still that those at the outer ring will still want to be gold card members eventually as well? Will they be allowed? These are already complicated political questions. A more fundamental problem, in my view, is that a lot of the multi-speed variable geometry solutions that we are developing or have developed come about because we run into a constitutional obstacle. And we can't really get there with the voting rules that we have, and yet we still think it's necessary, so we come up with an exception. And a second, and a third, and in the end we have a patchwork of exceptions that somehow still work as a system. Historically, one example of the sort of union that produces is the Holy Roman Empire, which was an incredible patchwork of all sorts of systems and rules and exceptions. Somehow it functioned, and it survived for hundreds of years. But those who try to study it most closely, like the German legal philosopher Samuel Pufendorf, in the end concluded that the thing it resembled most closely was a monster, because it seemed to have no logical structure to it. That is okay while we are able to manage the crises in front of us. But the risk with this complicated patchwork is that at some points you will run into something that doesn't allow for efficient decision making anymore, and the sort of emergency measures that are required have become too complicated. Now, I'm optimistic that the current defense challenge is not that, but the challenge in front of us, especially with the Americans seemingly doing an about turn and leaving the defense of the continent behind, is an enormous one. And we're operating at breakneck speed, and therefore also thinking at breakneck speed, and we're starting to improvise all new structures where we bring in Canadians because they're our allies, and we bring in the Norwegians because they're our allies too, and why not the Japanese and the Australians. But then you're left with a new structure that is half in the EU, half out, where you have to decide on the basis of unanimity. You run into the same sovereignty structures, and before you know it, you're going to have exceptions to that too, and it becomes very complicated when it comes to deciding about defense issues. The defense white paper focuses on very practical things. I'm not pessimistic about the fact that we can move even on seemingly difficult things like joint procurement, like improving infrastructure for military purposes. But we should be wary of the fact that that in the end there is an advantage to having a single system operating on one single system of rules as well, because we want to avoid ever running into this crisis where the problems suddenly become too great for mere improvisation to overcome.
Thank you, Joshua Livestro. Thank you, Marius Vaščega. Now it's time for questions. Yes, Ambassador, you are welcome.
I would like to say, I want to make a plea for the Klaus Juncker's report and for the for the sake of the discussion maybe as well. Not so much about the defense issue, because I fully agree with Joshua on that one, but Marius quite rightly quoted from the latest Euro barometer, and the number one was Denmark. And Denmark is one of these countries that very successfully kept its national identity, fully committed to Europe, but took certain exceptions with regard to the euro, with regard to migration. And seemingly, if one of the risks that we don't have a common European narrative and that we don't have all our citizens on board, I mean, just go outside the bubble, then maybe this for certain issues is a solution, that you provide the opportunity indeed to, well, not go ahead with certain parts of the integration process. There is, of course, a limit to this, because I was inspired by the gold card membership, but I would turn it around from the French perspective. I would say basically you subscribe to the core. You are a full-fledged member of the club. You have the tattoo to prove it, so to say, and whether or not you pay extra for a towel in the shower room, that's where we can differ. And in that way, I do think that we can have, particularly with, in my view, the necessary enlargement ahead of us, and I'm talking not as a Dutch ambassador, but as a citizen of Europe, then I think it would be quite valuable to have that option of the two speeds, and then you should make an exception to the explanation that was given before, that it is not necessary that you end up all at the same finish line, but that there is indeed also a difference on certain aspects, not on the core, but on certain aspects you can have a different interpretation and different practice on that issue. So I think it makes, in the end, it makes the European Union, even more perfect.
Thank you, Ambassador. Maybe there are some more questions. If somebody would like to ask. Okay, so Joshua, your comment? Did you have to?
No. Don't.
Okay. So slowly, I think we can finish our book talk and our debate about more perfect union. And I hope it's not last debate, not last conversation. Also here in National Library. So thank you for attention. Thank you once more for Joshua Livestro. Thank you for Marius Vaščega. Thank you, Ambassador, for comments, for reposts, and then see you soon until next meetings.